Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 alternate history video. Don't look at me that way, guys. I know. For those of you that are curious, it's been like 3 weeks since I actually put that poll out on the community post that gave your options for what it is that we were going to be doing for our next video. I have been, incredibly busy since then, so I'm sorry. I know, it's taken a long time for me to actually get back to this here again. But oh boy, do I have a lot to make. As many of you are aware by now, the way things work on here is that when I post these types of videos, the top 4 most liked suggestions or alternate history scenarios that people put in the comments section will then go into a poll to determine what the next video it is that we make. In this case, the one that won is what if Korea successfully rebelled against Japan before World War II? And that, well, that's a little bit of a hard question to actually answer. One of the reasons this video took me so long in the first place is that I struggled to figure out exactly when it is that I would start or how to build the scenario here in the first place. As I'm sure people have already seen many times, Japan starts out in 1936 actually with complete control of Korea. The reason for this is that back in the year 1910, that is when Korea was annexed by Japan, which made me think, okay, well then theoretically would I not be able to start potentially in the World War I mod, because when I do that one, then that means that Korea technically starts as a puppet and it won't get annexed until a few months into the game, because it starts in 1910. Yeah, okay, that was an option here, I guess, but there's a little bit of a problem when it comes to the actual history of things. See, in the scenarios that we build, we always try to approach this in a realistic manner. In order for something to happen, this means that certain other things had to happen before in order to make that possible. And the idea of Korea rebelling against Japan and getting its freedom is kind of ridiculous. For anyone that studied Asian history in this time period, they would know that China and Korea, and in general this entire region here, were completely and utterly backwards in the late 1800s. And it was, I think, 1895, after the first Sino-Japanese War, that Korea was made into basically a puppet of Japan, and there was really no way for China or Korea to fight back against them. Over the span of only like 30 years, Japan had rapidly modernized to be able to take on the powers of Asia, which were old and decrepit, in a way that hadn't really been seen since, well, the Europeans started showing up. The Japanese army was far larger, it was more disciplined, it was modernized, it was simply so much more effective that Korea had no real way to resist. It was completely controlled, and anything that the population tried to do against the Japanese would result in horrible, horrible consequences. This is why after the Japanese took things over in 1910, they immediately began to change the cultural landscape of Korea, from banning Korean family names, making them adopt Japanese names, to going and forcing them to worship at Shinto shrines, to trying anything they could do to erase their cultural identity and incorporate them not as Koreans, but just new Japanese people. And in many areas, this was quite effective. Yes, some Koreans did resist against the Japanese, but there was no real successful armed resistance of any kind. Maybe some minor civil disobedience, as would be seen in like 1919, but overall, the Japanese completely and utterly crushed every single thing that the Koreans put forth, which means the idea of them just breaking free when they have no actual military, leadership structure, or anything is ridiculous. It's not going to happen, guys. Okay, so there we go. Scenario over. There's nothing we can do. It's all done. Yay. No. We have to make this work. And the thing is, there is possibly a way that this does work, but it's not in Korea. As I already said, Korea did have its own resistance movements, but it wasn't really successful inside of Korea. What happened is many of the varying different ideological political leaders of the era, the varying different military fighting men, etc., had actually fled the country of Korea and had joined up in nationalist China, as well as communist China and others, in order to be able to launch their own kind of political movements to try and reclaim Korea. There were quite a number of army units that fought in China specifically against the Japanese invasion, and they would fiercely fight in order to be able to resist. In fact, it's one of those things that these units would then go back to Korea after it is that, Japan ultimately would lose the war and things ended up getting split, and that is one of the things that ended up contributing to the ideological split between communism in the north and, well, not communism, it's not exactly capitalism, but not communism in the south. Because those different ideological Koreans were fighting in all different warlords' armies over the course of the war. Thus, the question of how is it that we get Korea to be free before the beginning of World War II in 1939 is China has to do significantly better. The Koreans have to be able to return home earlier. So yeah, the reason why we are doing Road to 56 is because this is going to give us significantly more options. It greatly enlarges the natural Chinese focus tree, gives us more things that can actually be done, and in general gives us significantly more roleplay options that we can pursue. Going and selecting the historical path, we can see what it is that China would normally do, which in the case of after national reform, which determines politics, they would continue the people's tutelage and specifically try to expand their control. Nationalist China during this time was a very corrupt state, just as pretty much every Chinese warlord was in this time, but overall they would manage to eventually lead people to victory, even at the cost of millions of lives and horrible suffering. Looking at you, Chiang Kai-shek. The major problem that China had at the beginning, even though they have a ridiculously large army, is that the army is backwards and simultaneously has very little in the way of industry to be able to supply it. There was a big thing where over the course of the Second Sino-Japanese War, that a number of Chinese army units were straight up using swords and spears instead of guns because that's all it is that they actually had. So, in order for China to greater resist against the Japanese, we are going to make an argument from the very beginning that their industrial base is slightly larger, maybe from more foreign investment, slightly less corrupt practices, we will say, which, oh dear God, that isn't even saying something in the first place with how bad it actually was, but in general, there is more ability to produce equipment, and perhaps leaders are not nearly as incompetent as they were in our own timeline. Again, this is wishful thinking at this point, but it's for the scenario. As such, we're just going to give ourselves a couple more military factories, and that's pretty much all it is that we are going to be doing. We could also make the argument that in the previous warlord years that there had been less conflict between the central government and the warlords. Perhaps it is that they were able to exert more influence over the varying different entities, which means that there was less fighting, less bribes that had to be paid in order to be able to maintain a degree of control, and in general that less stupid crap happened. Because again, oh my God, we're pursuing this with such wishful thinking. Because, yeah, we suffer from warlord cliques, public illiteracy, an incompetent industry, an incompetent army. Oh, my lord. We have a incompetent navy industry. We are, well, still a major power in China, so that's something. And we are the sleeping dragon, which, oh, my lord, this is terrible. The argument that we will thus make is that some things had already been done, and done better, that China had invested a little bit more into its industry. Perhaps it gained greater knowledge or at least training from some foreign powers, like in the case of Germany or others who had sent over advisors to help them. And then instead of squabbling amongst themselves, that the external threat was prioritized perhaps a little bit earlier, with a National Defense Council being called in order to be able to address the rise of both the communists as well as the Japanese. With the idea that the Chinese maybe started their reforms, or at least were more successful with their reforms, a little bit earlier, considering their overwhelming numbers, this is something that has a multiplicative effect. That's something that many people don't realize. The reason why the Chinese perform so completely and utterly poorly, despite outnumbering the Japanese in so many cases, is because their quality was absolute trash. No, instead, we will assume that Chiang Kai-shek was actually a stronger leader in this time and was able to potentially unite more people behind him and be a little bit less corrupt. Although we've made significant progress, the people are still not ready for democracy. We must continue to have KMT guidance. And with that, my friends, we finally begin. Now, when we were building the scenario, it's allowed us to do things like get Tu Yuming as a army expert, which is something that's going to generate us army experience, which eventually is going to allow us at a faster rate to be able to go and actually improve our military. Because where is it? Yeah, the army situation is absolutely terrible, and it's going to cost us 100 military experience every time in order to be able to improve this, which we are going to do faster in this time, but it's still something that's not necessarily going to be great. We can't just automatically assume that the Chinese do amazing, but yeah. Problems in the Sichuan. Reports of starvation and drought in Sichuan have started to appear in newspapers. Some organizations have been raising money to aid the affected. If we offer to help the people in Sichuan, it would potentially grant us additional political power over the area. Yeah, we will say that the government, maybe they had less problems. There was less famine in this time, less issues, so the government was able to exert more control. Maybe they had a little bit more money to do so. Which, from that, be able to invest more into Korean military units. As the people's tutelage is continued, the next step after this would be to rapidly engage in modernizing the military, in building up the actual amount of equipment. We can assume from this time that perhaps from years of efforts that were done before, as well as maybe less fighting, that the overall amount of equipment that the Chinese could have at this time could be as much as 50% more. That this means that not every person is going to be armed with a stick when the beginning of the war begins. After all that, because of the limitations that we face naturally within the focus tree on what it is that we can really do, and there is no point in saying, oh, well, they're just immediately preparing for war in 1936, necessarily from the start here, we will say that more internal developments happen, from national railway lines being built, to trying to modernize the army, and even from that, actually working to perhaps integrate more of the warlord forces so that, well, things are not nearly as unstable and the warlords actually cooperated more together than they did in our own timeline. Historically, what actually happened is that the Central Army was focused on while the warlord armies were used as basically cannon fodder, which it quite literally does say here. But in this new timeline, we will say that there were more efforts to actually work together amongst the warlords, which means that the Chinese were able to better resist the Japanese. No, actually, I take back what I say. Apparently, I can't do this until the warlords don't exist, which I need to figure out exactly what to do in that regard. Different opinions on where to fortify. Some of our generals and von Falkenson have a different opinion about where our main fortification efforts will be put into. They all agree Shanghai should be our first priority, but not so about the Japanese invasion from the north. Some of our generals suggest that we should hold Beijing to our last man. However, von Falkenson thinks that the plain in northern China will give the mechanized Japanese troops a huge advantage, thus we should fortify along the Yellow River instead. Whose opinion shall we heed? The thing is, if we were going to be doing this in the same historical timeline where China is lesser prepared, like they're not as good, it's like the same exact crap that it was in our own timeline, then I would say, yeah, we would go all the way down to the Yellow River and fortify things there so that it's a stronger defensive position and more easily defendable. In this case, no, they'll actually probably be in a position where Beijing will not fall. And so, to defend ourselves from the Japanese threat, we must unify the Chinese people, which, from this here, there will be volunteers from all across the territory that Japan occupies. In this case, we'll say that even more Koreans show up in order to be able to try and defend things. Or, I say, not show up, but more Koreans fled the Korean peninsula over the course of the initial Japanese occupation than they did in our own time. Every man, woman, and child must be willing to fight and die together in China's defense. Yes, indeed. Oh, great. The Xinjiang clique is declaring war on Tanagistan. Fun. Thanks. Yeah, this is exactly what we need in this timeline here. Thank you so much. Even then, we're not going to be able to necessarily stop the warlords from fighting amongst each other. Hey, perhaps with enough bribes, maybe some internal control, maybe the warlords even stop fighting to a degree. Maybe it is that the central government is able to exert some control. Of course, by 1937, Japan will still be justifying against China. They will still prefer to utilize some sneaky stuff that is going to damage, well, pretty much everything. This, my friends, of course, brings us to the Marco Polo Bridge incident, something that is still bound to happen as the Japanese were going to do what it is that they did best, which is start some shit back at the beginning of the war. Japanese soldiers recently launched an attack on the strategic Marco Polo Bridge just south of Beijing, but they were repelled by our brave soldiers. No doubt this is an orchestrated event aimed at placing blame on us and forcing us to surrender even more territory, just like the Mukden incident when the Japanese invaded Manchuria. How do we respond? No, we have reached the breaking point. This, of course, brings us to the War of Resistance. What we greatly feared for a long time has occurred. The Japanese, who have been meddling in our country and abusing our people far too long, have finally pushed things so far that a war has broken out between us. With this, the War of Resistance has broken out, and it is time to fight for our very first survival. This does, however, bring up a question. Do we invite other Chinese cliques to join this great fight? Yes, obviously, we do. That in turn leads to peace between the varying different warlords, who we can only assume were not as violent as they arguably were in our own timeline. And we then launched the Dare to Die Corps. If we are to win the war against the invaders, our people must be brave enough not to fear death. They must be willing to do whatever it takes to defend our nation. Yeah, no, if you actually know the history of what it is that these guys did, it's actually kind of insane. With that, we will say that faster than in our own time, China actually unites behind itself more. What is happening here? Why are they at war? They are still at war with the Shanxi clique. Why? Should you not be declaring peace? What is going on here? Oh dear God, the Japanese have launched strikes all along the coast. Yes, well, just as what happened in our own timeline, the Japanese would launch multiple strikes. Except what we will assume in this time is that control was actually able to be maintained. That while the Japanese would gain some initial footholds, that these units were potentially eventually surrounded and destroyed. Our loss is still going to be terrible? Yes, they probably are. That is absolutely true. But we will need to bounce back as quickly as we can. In the event that the government is actually able to hold back the Japanese, especially initially, this may allow the central government to put more control over the warlords. Both the Central Army and the warlords' forces comprise our current military. However, the warlords' forces are not very obedient towards our command. We will have a more efficient army if we somehow gain their trust. There we go. Even though the Japanese could make some breakthroughs, potentially with enough Chinese support, with there actually being more guns available, if they had performed better and were more competent, then perhaps it is that they would be able to slow them down. Very quickly, it seems, even though the Japanese were able to make some gains, their lines were very quickly overstretched, and then on top of that, they are unable to surround and take out any major cities. The losses of which would be absolutely horrendous. Oh my god, are you seriously doing this again? Balancing this is so annoying. There we go. Also, with the additional negotiations of being able to purchase arms from the United States, it is very likely at this time that China would be able to be flooded with very different guns. Which, actually, if we assume this, that China is able to get a stronger economy from the very get-go, that means more money to buy guns from the United States. Which actually means that even then the United States is going to get its own military industry boosted during this time. Oh, not this crap again. Come on. All right, yes. The Japanese will continuously launch varying different incursions. This is something that, of course, is naturally going to happen. But with enough efforts, potentially it is that they can be contained. What is likely to happen at this point is that heading into the middle of 1938, significantly more resources from Japan will have to be dedicated to the Chinese front. This is going to be necessary as they're not able to actually push through, and they're going to have to escalate the conflict. This means that many more men, more resources, more everything will have to be levied, and from that, you will likely see significantly more push to pull some of the troops that would be stationed in Korea to the northern front. Especially if the multiple incursions that are launched into the coastal settlements of China are surrounded and destroyed. With no ability to reinforce them, this means that Japan would suffer huge manpower losses. And potentially after over a year of conflict and actually demonstrating successful counterattacks against the Japanese, it means that the army of the Chinese, with significantly more manpower, or I should say manpower, more resources to arm that manpower, it means that they would be able to do, well, more. They would remove their sense as an incompetent army. Naturally, as one could possibly expect, because of how poor of a performance the Japanese would, well, put on, this means that you would see probably greater disturbances at home in Japan, as even though the news would be censored about what was happening on the front, word would reach the emperor that things were not going to plan. Gradually, Japanese units that are exhausted are wrapped up. This would lead to absolutely devastating losses on the front, as the initial Japanese excursions into the mountains, as well as the plains surrounding Beijing, would eventually cause them to be overrun. Until theoretically, heading into the beginning of 1939, it is here then that the Chinese, in their better position, would be able to launch a major counterattack. The gradual weakening of the Japanese line that would take place due to continuous efforts by the Japanese of launching naval strikes against the coastal settlements of China would allow the Chinese to be able to push deep into the northern heartlands. Considering how unstable Manchukuo was already, this would very quickly mean its collapse, as varying different bandit groups would likely rise up in defiance across the state. Desperately, the Japanese at the time may launch additional strikes in order to be able to distract Chinese forces, but by this point, with additional industrial capacity, the Chinese forces would greatly outnumber the Japanese. As the different puppet states established by Japan gradually collapsed, this would only weaken the front line further. It is quite possible at this time, considering the relation, that the Soviet Union, which had been at odds with the Japanese, would throw their weight behind the support of the Chinese, with the Chinese Central Army receiving much of the support, as they would be doing the majority of the fighting, and actually being in a stronger political position to do something. Eventually, all the way down to Korea, the land would be liberated of Japanese influence. With the complete and utter destruction of Japanese forces throughout Asia, this would force Japan to offer peace. Likely, we would see a military coup take place within the government, as the different military officials who had led the conflict would be overthrown. Despite the Chinese performing significantly better in this conflict, and you may think at that point, well, they're likely to then go and still continue to fight with the Japanese to take even more. No, we built a stronger China in this timeline that actually allows us to go and, well, win, but the issue is they're still going to be in horrible amounts of debt, millions of people will still be dead, and there will be horrible losses, while at the same time they will still have to deal with the warlords. A stronger China in this position will be able to consolidate its power and then focus internally, and that is going to be the effort that has to be done. The war has been won. The Empire of Korea will be free. As for what is going to happen now to the Empire of Korea, you can see it actually has its own focus tree in here, which is something that is fascinating. Technically speaking, I could have done something as Japan, where I went and liberated Korea and then played as them as a puppet, but that doesn't really make much sense considering the scenario. Instead, in our own timeline, what had happened is that after World War II, the hundreds of thousands of different Koreans that had been spread out across these parts of Asia. In fact, I think there was 725,000 Korean workers alone that had been forced into Japan in order to work during the war effort, is that they would go back to their homeland. The varying different Korean fighters who had been part of the Chinese nationalist forces, who had been part of the communist forces, who had been part of all the varying different entities, they would gradually come back and be divided into two camps. In fact, the Kim family that would take charge of North Korea had actually fought with the Chinese communists on their side. So, with the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek actually performing significantly better in this conflict, it means that Korea would more than likely become a somewhat autocratic democracy, something to where it is a republic in basically name only, but it is not a communist state. With that, my friends, Japan would be significantly weakened. Not only that, but there's a very low chance that they would pursue any other conflicts, instead turning internal as well as more isolationist. The reason being is that, well, one of the key reasons behind Japanese expansion into the south or the north is specifically for a drive for resources that were necessary in order to be able to keep their war in China going. With the loss of this and the destruction of their military forces and severe debt that they would be suffering from, as well as likely what we'd see with a coup that would take place in the government, there is no reason to continue. The Second Great War would start, and yet Japan would do nothing. It would not be in a position to be able to strike southwards, and after the conflicts that would take place over here, they would see it as being too risky. There's no way that the Japanese would launch a strike upon Pearl Harbor. There's no way that they could do any of that. It would simply be impossible. Instead, what would follow is likely years of uncertainty within China. Eventually, it is that the communists and the nationalists are going to go to war with one another. In fact, knowing Chiang Kai-shek, there is a decent chance that after the victory and the signing of peace with Japan, that while communist forces are still stationed elsewhere, that Chiang Kai-shek and a series of other warlords would launch their own coordinated strike in order to wipe them out, thus igniting another Chinese civil war. As for what the actual result of that would be, well, the problem is Chiang Kai-shek was kind of a corrupt bastard. He really was. He was also not a great leader, militarily or politically, which means he generated a lot of enemies. The communists, though small in number initially in the beginning, very quickly gained a lot of supporters amongst the population for the promises that they made in order to reform the government, land, to give land to the peasants in the first place. This was a very big draw for them. Chiang Kai-shek and his oligarchic buddies didn't really do very much in order to support the peasantry, which gradually turned the majority of the population against him and would side with the communists. Despite the grand victory and the uniting of varying different warlords, there is still a decent chance that that happens. And if that does, and the CCP is able to rise to power in China in this time, it will be a China that experienced significantly less in the way of destruction. It is a China which lost millions less men. It is a China that would be in the perfect potential position to rise as the second great communist power after the Soviet Union. In fact, there is a chance that if they manage to take things over earlier, potentially within the next 2 years or 3 years, by 1941 or 1942, that millions of Chinese communists would be able to surge over the border of the Soviet Union and protect against the invasion against Germany, thus allowing the communists to be able to push further and faster into Germany, allowing the world to become significantly more communist. The Iron Curtain would spread far deeper into Western Europe than it did in our own time. With that, my friends, I think that we are going to leave things here today. This is a scenario that is kind of hard to build off of. Korea is something that eventually, after this, would likely see its military junta replaced with a communist state in that time period, if that's what we see happen. Otherwise, really, who knows what would happen? The amount of things that we had to change in order to make this possible in the first place is insane. So, yeah, that's the end of that. Make sure to go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, put your suggestions down in the comment section below, and my friends, I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you for watching.